Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies. Tonight, in collaboration with the Party of Communist USA's Arts and Culture Commission, we will be doing a class on communism and Soviet art in the Soviet Union. As always, the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies is a Party of Communist USA sponsored school, so this does allow us to have a wide variety of topics and discussions. So tonight, we will have a discussion on what is art in the USSR, and as well we'll be talking about Soviet realism and versus abstract expressionism, which was the antithesis in a way and also CIA backed. Our next section will be on art movements throughout Soviet history, and then our last section will be on famous artists and famous events and the artists behind them. So our first section tonight will be on Soviet realism, and for that, I will turn the floor over to General Secretary Joe Washington. You have the floor, sir.
All right, thank you. Section 1, Socialist Realism. What is art to the USSR? Socialist Realism versus Abstract Expressionism. Socialist Realism, art of the masses. Realism, and especially Soviet realism, drew on the human condition rather than an abstract idea. The everyday worker was a celebrated subject as opposed to spontaneity. Per F.J. Klingender in Marxism and Modern Art on realism, the attitude of the artist who strives to reflect some essential aspect of reality and to face the problems set by life, is from its very nature popular. It reflects the outlook of those men and women who produce the means of life. Origins and purpose. One development on socialist realism occurred at the first All-Union Congress of Soviet Writers in 1934. There, the mission of Soviet realism was influenced by the earlier credo of the Association of Artists of Revolutionary Russia. Our civic duty before mankind is to set down artistically and documentarily the revolution impulse of this great moment of history. We will depict the present day, the workers, the peasants, the revolutionaries, and the heroes of labor. And here we have a video.
Kind of introduced the term socialist realism in a 1932 article in the Literaturnaya Gazeta. Subsequently, it was declared as the official doctrine in the 1934 Soviet Congress, All-Soviet Congress of Writers, affirming entry to the final period of socialist construction. In conjunction with the anti-fascist Popular Front, Comrade Zhdanov called for the eradication of the last bourgeois elements from social life and from consciousness. And this was precisely the task of socialist realism. And I quote Zhdanov, "Overcoming the survivals of capitalism in the consciousness of people means fighting against all relics of bourgeois influence, of the proletariat, against laxity, against loafing, against idling, against petty bourgeois dissoluteness and individualism, against an attitude of graft and dishonesty towards public property." End of the quote. Zhdanov affirmed Stalin's call for writers to be, and here's the scary concept, engineers of human souls, firmly grounded in the material basis of social life, and urged them to replace bourgeois romanticism with what he called revolutionary romanticism. According to Zhdanov, the task of Soviet literature and of socialist realism was to overcome the belatedness of consciousness in comparison to the advanced level of the relations of production. And it was this type of new consciousness that had to be engineered. Art, literature, music, film had a crucial and instrumental function. This engineering of consciousness had to start with the new Soviet man.
Realism versus abstractism. Per Donald Jameson, former CIA case officer. Regarding abstract expressionism, I love to be able to say that the CIA invented it just to see what happens in New York and downtown Soho tomorrow. But I think that what we did really was to recognize the difference. It was recognized that abstract expressionism was the kind of art that made socialist realism look even more stylized and more rigid and confined than it was. And that relationship was exploited in some of the exhibitions. and so one could quite adequately and accurately reason that anything they criticized that much and that heavy-handedly was worth supporting one way or another. Congress for Cultural Freedom. Set up by funding from the CIA itself describes the CCF as one of the CIA's more daring and effective Cold War covert operations. Abstract Expressionism and other forms counter to Soviet realism were spread through this organization and affiliates, which ran art showings throughout the world. CIA involvement was unknown until 1967. Remnants continue operations in the Ford Foundation and other billionaire-backed endowments. It's still going today.
Thank you, General Secretary Joe. And with that, we will break for our first round of discussions.
Yeah, real quick. I remember, I don't know if it was a documentary or a book, but I remember somewhere they said in history that the Nazis actually took note from Soviet art about the real impactful, solid, bright colors of red and black and white. And I want to know if anybody has any insight onto the Nazis stealing our very bold color style. Thank you.
I can't give you a definite opportunity, but if you take that the Nazi Party itself was the National Socialist Party and took that aesthetic from it, I guess it would stand to reason that they also borrowed that. I do see some other hands that went up at that, though.
Yeah, there's a particular section in Mein Kampf where Hitler discusses the fact that they stole the aesthetics of the communists to appeal to working people.
Thank you.
Yeah, so about the Center of Cultural Freedom or what have you is obviously that's like a bit more of a nefarious, like insidious means of countering socialist modernism. But in my research, there was a comparison between just regular old social realism and socialist realism, and how a lot of the art that was coming out of America during the Dust Bowl and a lot of realism that was coming out at that time was government funded in a part. And from what I can tell, not in even like a nefarious oh, we have to beat the Soviets something. It was having government funded art projects is just not, it's actually a lot more commonplace.
60
So
seconds.
people can point to the art that came out of the Soviet Union under socialist realism and be like, oh, well, the only reason it worked is because it was government funded. But actually, that's kind of how art has always existed. I just wanted to add that.
Thank you, comrade. Another interesting tidbit was the Congress of Cultural Freedom also had some of its funding foundations within the Rockefellers, especially the late Senator John Jay.
What immediately came to mind with that last slide was all about AI. I can't help but think what they're doing and what purposes it's serving. It sounds to me like there's a lot of speculation and money and plans going into AI and financing it. So it sounds to me like we're back to Jackson Pollock again.
Thank you, comrade. And yeah, I've even heard some other groups online saying they're now going to use AI soon to make full-length movies that don't need all these actors and people from Hollywood and workers.
Yeah, I got a question on the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And piqued that interest in that with that last comment he said. Those same groups that, are looking to use AI to get rid of, the workers that make, and these are groups on the left, by the way, that are bringing this up. And they claim to be communists themselves. They also blame the Congress for Cultural Freedom for any social progressivism. Are there any comments on that they're trying to blame the CIA and the Congress for Cultural Freedom, not just for their countering the Soviet with the arts, but they're blaming it for all social progressivism? Anything on that?
Oh, thank you, comments. Emeritus Secretary Angelo, go ahead. You have the floor.
Okay. The Congress of Cultural Freedom was basically used by the ultra-left, the Trotskyites, and the independent petty bourgeois radicals were very supportive of that. Their magazine was called Partisan Review. That was their cultural magazine. We, communists, had the Liberator and the New Masses. They had what I just said, Partisan Review. And I remember during the Vietnam War, that magazine was for the war in Vietnam. And it was considered a Trotskyite magazine, and they supported the war in Vietnam. Once again, the ultra-left is left informed, but right in essence. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo. And I briefly saw that Comrade had flashed the book on the screen, The Cultural Cold War by Francis Stoner Saunders, which is a great read, and I do highly recommend it, about all that time period of the CIA meddling in the 40s through the 60s.
Anecdotally, just the importance of what is displayed. So my friend from Burma, actually, she's in the States now, with the TV there. Well, first of all, her father thought the world was flat. Okay, so we're talking the 70s and the 80s, and this is like I say, in Burma. But he also thought the cartoons on TV were real. He thought cartoons were real. And it's just sort of anecdotal. You have to understand the impact that this can have. We know better, but that doesn't mean subliminally that we do. So I always take that as caution that we have to be careful, even in a Zoom meeting.
Thank you, Comrade. Though I would love to hear his thoughts on Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Comrade Angelo, go ahead.
Okay. Remember, opposite to socialist realism was Picasso. Very interesting. Picasso was really opposite of that, and he was a diehard communist. So I have some confusion in that. I don't know if anybody here could explain that. Thank you.
Yeah, my understanding is that Picasso was not strictly an abstract artist either. He painted in many different styles, and I think my understanding of that goes back to, because there was initially in Soviet Russia there was a constructivist movement,
Right.
Which was close to Cubism.
Right.
I think there was also close to Dada and all that good stuff, but so there was, I don't think that the division was so hard and fast, and not necessarily, because I've seen a lot of socialist realist paintings that used a lot of Cubist techniques also, so it wasn't exclusively like realistic depictions per se. It was more the realism of the subject matter.
Yeah, I think did put it very well. I would just say, yeah, I mean, Picasso understood what the Soviet Union was trying to do. And I think this is probably the case for a lot of scientists and artists and writers and great minds who were in the West and doing great work, but also knew that so then you could be like, oh, well, they were living in the US. It's not that simple. It's like they understood the necessity and the endeavor that the Soviet Union was undertaking. I don't know if I can explain it any better than that.
Thank you, Comrade.
Yeah, real quick, just to echo and add on to what everyone has said, it's correct. Picasso could do classical art painting, but he just found, I think, later in his life that he had more of a passion to do this abstract stuff. It talks more to him, but he could do more classical works. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade. With that, we will move on to our next section, which is actually on different art styles in the Soviet Union. And for that section, Comrade, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah, so something that I was told a long time ago that I had in my mind while I was developing this section is I had a teacher once who told me that you can learn about history through art. And I didn't know what he meant at first, but it's an interesting way to look at history through the different art movements of the decades and the way that it reflects the history and the reality at the time. And I think that that holds a lot of water, especially as we're going through the history of the Soviet Union, how it shifts and changes through the different art movements. So here we go. So the art movement that was happening at the time, and this was in Europe and in the West and on an international movement, but also in Russia, was the Avant-Garde movement. So Avant-Garde was the general term meaning at the front or vanguard to indicate the break from societal norms in the art world. Similar to, I would say, the vanguard of a communist party, avant-garde art was seen as a way to make art serve the people and develop radical changes, not only in art, not only in culture, but also as a means to make changes in the economic, political, and social norms. In imperialist Russia, the avant-garde art scene saw itself as a very scientific tool to break from the rule of the Tsar and bring about a new society. And this is a general term meaning a lot of things fall under the umbrella of avant-garde, including cubism, including futurism, and neo-primitivism, constructivism, and suprematism. And it's just when you're learning more about the avant-garde movement, the more not only the name, meaning vanguard, and its goal of creating a new society, essentially, and the time period that it was, wasn't a coincidence that this was the same time that Marxism-Leninism as an ideology was also taking shape. And then over here on the right, we have an artwork called 30, and this is a quote by the artist saying, which I think is a pretty good explanation or summation of avant-garde, which is, there is no must in art because art is free. Next slide, please. This is a good video. She explains it better than I can.
The exhibition covers the period from about 1912 to 1934. And more or less, it's the period that we consider to be kind of the high point of the Russian avant-garde in terms of artistic practice. But what's really interesting about this moment is the way that art and societal change, governmental change, history are all so inextricably intertwined. So when people ask about the revolution, the historical event they're really talking about happens in 1917. And so what we're talking about is a moment in which the long-ruling dynastic family of Russia, they've been in power for 300 years at this point, is seen by the people as occupying this kind of elevated position, this position of luxury and control, where the people of Russia are really struggling, a lot of them. And so there is this kind of groundswell that comes from the population, a desire for a new government, a government that's going to be by them and for them. Artists are really starting to think about how they can make positive contributions to the goals of the revolution. How can they really contribute to society? They decide maybe it's no longer really about being in the studio and making easel painting. And in fact, easel painting would come to be kind of phased out by some of these artists in the not too distant future. But in the meantime, they're thinking about what's the way in which we're going to communicate with people. And there is a kind of decision among artists like Rodchenko, whose work we see here, that it's going to be a language of abstraction. But it has to be something that's clear, something that's understandable. So in drawings like these, what Rodchenko does is he goes to these kind of objective tools. He uses a ruler, he uses a compass. He's able to almost scientifically map out his drawing. It's not about kind of his imagination in the studio, a kind of daydreaming, an invention. It's about a kind of concrete, real world, kind of constructed way of thinking. And that, in a way, is where this term constructivism comes from. It's the idea of making a type of work that has a kind of concrete place in the world, using this kind of abstract language. One of my favorite works in this gallery is this group of 6 drawings by the artist Alexandra Exter. And they're actually plans for stage sets that she was thinking about or designing. So you see them here in beautiful color, sets for The Merchant of Venice, for Romeo and Juliet. When you kind of start to peel the excess away and look at just kind of the bones of these drawings, you realize that this is in fact that abstract language. Those kind of repeating parallel lines, or those kind of even cross-hatchings, those diagonals that move across compositions, just kind of expanded out to live possibly in the real world, in this case the world of the theater. So we find ourselves now in the only monographic gallery in this exhibition, and what that really means is the only gallery devoted to the work of a single artist. That artist is L. Lissitzky. Lissitzky was such a critical figure not only in the Russian avant-garde, but in the Western avant-garde as well. And it was because he had such a kind of multifaceted way of thinking about and looking at the world. The project that's here behind me is perhaps one of the projects that he's best known for. And it was the creation of something that he invented called the Prown. So Prown is actually an invented term, and it's an acronym. It stands for Project for the Affirmation of the New. And it really comes out of Lissitzky's philosophical thinking. It's not something that's so easily grasped, quite honestly. One of the great things about this project is that Lissitzky actually included with it a manifesto of Prown, trying to kind of explicate for people, and probably also for himself, what its parameters were and what its real meaning was. So you see here the Russian version of this manifesto, which he then translates, just the first part of, into German. German was another one of his primary languages. But I think, as you can see, it's something that isn't necessarily a one-line concept. It's something that could have philosophical implications. It's something that can have theoretical implications. It's something that can have real-world implications. So it's a very kind of interesting three-dimensional, 360 way of Lissitzky theorizing about the world. If you look at a Prown like this one, this is Prown 6b, you see that Lissitzky's annotated the composition here at the bottom right, suggesting that this is how you can see the image. But then you notice that there's also a similar marking on this corner, suggesting that you could in fact rotate this and see it as a vertical composition. And even more interesting, in this Prown 1, you see that it actually has at least 4 possible orientations. And for me, that suggests that not only can you see them kind of in the round, but you could start to see them rotating through space. It was about shaping reality, and they were looking beyond just the single pair of eyes on something to how could I get more people to see this and understand this. So in the case of Lissitzky's Prown, the idea of making a lithography portfolio, he didn't end up making very many of them, but even 12 could go out into the world. He could send them to colleagues at other university campuses, at other art institutes, in cities beyond the one where he was based, and in that way try to create a kind of ripple effect, really send these ideas out, let them reverberate, let much larger audiences have access to them.
So, of the several art movements under the avant-garde movement, the first we'll do is talk about suprematism in the 1913 to 1920s. As it was emerging from the Russian avant-garde, it rejected any sort of representational art, and it was just pure abstraction. And instead of interpreting the world, it intended on transcending reality. Or, as another phrase is, instead of interpreting the world, it maybe seek to transform it. Like our good friend Karl Marx would say, there's a lot of similarities between these two different ideologies. Using simple shapes and colors, it was designed to provoke more of a pure emotion and human experience on like the most pure basic level. And of course, it was meant as a radical break from all the art that had came before, as a new sort of supreme movement. So on the right here, we have what is Black Suprematic Square by Kazimir Malevich, which is described as, quote, "It is from zero, in zero, that the true movement of being begins." Now, this painting took him 2 years because he actually made an entire cubist painting. He had a whole other thing going on here. And then over time, it was just make it more simple, make it more pure, to the point where it just became what you see before you, which is simply a black square. And one of the video essays that I was listening to explained this as, you could argue is this is the invention of the pixel, which is it cannot get more simple. It cannot get more, it's literally starting from zero. So that's the whole point, is everything in history as far as art is concerned before then is the old world, and we are starting not even from literally ground zero. And not only was this an example of one of the arts that they would have, but this in the gallery that this is exhibited in, is it was put up in the corner of the room. So it was kind of looking down, and it was essentially being put up in the spot of the room that was usually held by like a Christian Orthodox icon. So it was literally replacing God and religion as a new sort of supreme ideology and art movement. And it's basically like God is dead and we're killing him with art. So that was part of the whole suprematism movement. But it was also just confined within the art and the galleries and the studios itself, which is different from constructivism, which we'll get into in the next slide. So, constructivism came out of that because it's still the small shapes and colors and so on and so forth. But it saw art not as an end unto itself, not sort of as a thing to be self-contained, but as a tool to be used to better society. It was still very utilitarian and geometrical in form, but the purpose of the style was to create a whole new social engineering. Or I think in one of the videos was getting to the point where you're getting these ideas of how do we engineer the actual human soul or the human psyche. It's completely stripped of subjective emotions and even like paint. It's just shapes on the canvas or words on the canvas, if you're even using canvas, for the explicit use of propaganda and social purposes. It's considered art not to be confined to a museum, but to be out in the world, to be on the streets and in every aspect of everyday life that they could possibly put this stuff into. And on the right here, we have a piece that you've probably seen before, which is Beat the Whites with the Red Wedge. And this is one of the reasons why I like constructivism, is because you can feel emotions and you can have like a subjective experience with it, but there's really only one interpretation of this painting. And that is the red wedge is the Red Army, and the white circle is the White Army being defeated by the Red Army during the Russian Civil War. That's it. And if you have any other interpretation, good for you, but you're pretty much wrong. Like, that's it. That's the one and only interpretation, because that's how constructivism works. It's not about going off the rails. It's about, this is what it is. This is how we're going to use it. It's a very concrete objective with what they're trying to use the art for, and like, get out of the way, essentially. Next slide. So there's so many. Okay, I'll just read the paragraph first. That makes it easier. So we make a transition from the avant-garde and constructivism and suprematism and a couple other art movements, and we start transitioning to socialist realism, and that can be very confusing. It took me a while to begin to understand how you could come from all of this abstract art to what's very realistic depictions of reality. So avant-garde may have helped. Well, it definitely did help. I don't know why I wrote that. It definitely helped break away from the old world of the Tsar, but the Soviet Union was continuing to consolidate power. They were continuing to grow and develop as a society. The USSR was not only continuing to grow as this new society, but they were also beginning to become the successors of Russian history, is basically my take on it. So they needed to get an art style that still had the function of constructivism, something that had a means to an end and that was going to develop their society, but have an aesthetics that was more like the classical art that came before the avant-garde movement of the classics, as I say. So instead of having a complete wipe of society like suprematism was going for, the reason why socialist realism came to be is because it was taking the good from constructivism and it was using it with the good that was also from the previous part of Russian civilization, to put it as simply as I possibly can. I didn't hear this specifically, but there's some slight anarchist tendencies that you could almost interpret from the avant-garde movement. Or it was certainly a little bit accelerationist. It was like, we need a new society and we need to go as fast as we possibly can. And that turned out, as we know from a bit more of a historical or ideological perspective, is that's not sustainable. You can't just keep being the craziest lefty on the block decade after decade. You have to consolidate with what people want and what people are used to in order to retain power. There were so many video essays and articles that I read that was like, oh, the avant-garde was the greatest thing, and then mean old Stalin came around and made socialist realism the state art form, and then it was all over. There were so many video essays that gave that, and it was like, oh, okay, here we go again. And it's interpreting it as if the avant-garde and socialist realism are these completely mutually exclusive art movements. But as I hope I've explained, is actually socialist realism was the inevitable necessity to come from the growth of the avant-garde movement that started the whole thing. At least I hope so. Next slide. So then we get socialist realism. So socialist realism took the constructive purposes of the avant-garde period and turned it back into a representative depiction of everyday life. The realism, meaning the depiction of the lives of citizens living under socialist society. Realism was not started under the Soviet Union, and it wasn't started in the 20th century while we're at it. Realism as an artistic phenomenon was a long-standing thing, and it's one of the ideas I've got while I was developing this for a whole other class. But it's using realist artistic interpretations and turning it towards socialist society. So that's where socialist realism comes from. This art movement was simultaneously meant to be a reflection of reality while also providing examples of an ideal, specifically like what the Soviet man is. And it did become the official state-sanctioned art style in 1934, as we, I think, discussed earlier, for the Soviet Union, and then other socialist countries in the aftermath of World War II. So, like I said, socialist realism was the state-sanctioned art movement for the rest of the Soviet Union. But there were other art movements that happened underground. And I could go a million different directions with this, where I could be like, oh, they were all bad because they were resisting Soviet rule, or the Soviet Union was maybe gripping really tightly onto something like art that they expected to just stick around for decade after decade. That's also a whole other class that I don't think I can get into right now. So I'm just going to try and, as objectively as possible, talk about the art movements that did happen in the post-Stalin eras, essentially, that were not socialist realism, so that we can have a little bit of a broader historical picture, because the fact that they existed in the first place and the way that they existed and the way that the Soviet Union handled it is also, in my opinion, a reflection of the slow, gradual decline of the Soviet Union itself. So there were basically, it all started with the death of Stalin, like a lot of things. And from 1954 until the end of the Soviet Union, there were underground art movements. These two pieces are specifically from the 60s. There were several art movements during the Khrushchev thaw that were never officially recognized by the Artists' Union. There were ebbs and flows of the state's tolerance of such movements. Sometimes they just let them slide. Sometimes they cracked down on them with things like bulldozers. Socialist realism, however, remained the state-sanctioned art form until 1991. Now, I don't want to I can't say whether something is art or not, but I wanted to provide this slide as an example of a couple of exhibits that happened after the fall of the Soviet Union to give at least some sort of justification for what the state might have been trying to prevent. We've already talked about how the United States government can use art as a sort of subvertive tool to try and bring down socialist governments. That's another class that, I'd love to do. Just all about that. But these are a couple of examples of some of the, they're both from a single artist in the 90s. And basically, after the fall of the Soviet Union, art began to take radical and shocking new directions, where can art be moral? Can art be a criminal act? Can art be good or bad? Were all questions that were beginning to come to post-Soviet Russia. They had already kind of been answered in the West, but now with the fall of the Soviet Union, they came to Russia in full force. And so the one on the left is a picture of a exhibit that was called The Piglet Gives Gifts. And it was a performance where a pig was slaughtered in the corner of a gallery and then butchered, and the pieces of meat were distributed to the people seeing the gallery. And that was in 1992. And then on the right is another exhibit or performance piece called Doghouse, where the artist named Oleg Kulik was obviously chained like a dog in the exhibit. And there was a sign displayed that basically said, like, beware of dog, or like, don't come close, or like, stay away, or something like that. And when exhibit goers didn't see the sign or ignored the sign and got too close to him, he attacked them and bit them. And I can't say whether this is art or not, or whether this is good or bad, or even whether I think that was a good idea or not. Art is art, and I think I'm not a guy who, I like to see art. I actually kind of like Jackson Pollock. I like to see art as free and open as possible. But I think it's clear that this is the sort of swing that art took immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union that was probably leaving a bad taste in a lot of Russian citizens' mouths.
Thank you, comrade. We'll now break for our second discussion round.
Thank you. I've enjoyed this class a lot, and I think it just touched on a couple of very interesting things. We can also apply it to what's art has been going on here in the West, here in the US, here in a lot of the Western European places. What's been one of the biggest trends in the past 30, 40 years of art is art that is kind of broken down to it's barely even recognizable. I mean, there's stuff like, here's a recreation of a pharmacy, and it's just a pharmacy. I mean, it's impressive, but what is it actually trying to say? And I think that's a big problem with a lot of art that's promoted, is a lot of artists that are promoted aren't actually saying anything. They're not people with, vision or philosophies or ideas they want to promote. A lot of people that get promoted are people who know what's trendy and popular. And we know in the West that art is only promoted by wealthy capitalists and wealthy foundations, and they're going to support a couple of art trends, and that's affecting a lot of us here. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade.
Okay, so the first thing, thanks again for going through that. That was a really great brief history of Soviet art. And at the beginning there, you talked about the constructionism, movement, and you brought up that that picture that we all know and it had that very direct name. I believe it was Beats the Whites with a Red Wedge. And I have that on my, it's a picture that I love. The thing is, when I was looking at the picture that we had in the PowerPoint, the red wedge looked like a wooden block. I never have noticed because I just have always seen it as like a red pure color, a solid color. But if you go back to that slide, it almost looked like a block. And I know what you said. Oh, it has a direct meaning. It's this. There's no other way to interpret it. But I really liked it because it made it look like a tool, like a wooden block.
60 seconds.
That you could use it as a wedge. And it had a kind of a more abstract meaning, dare I say, of the Red Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution. So I don't know, that's just interpretation. Real quick though, we see socialist realism whenever we hear the American propaganda of the Soviet Union, pictures of Stalin and whatnot. But would you actually see constructionism, just like in the cities of Moscow or
90
other
seconds.
forms of art? That was my question. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, without having been there, I can say for sure, or having seen pictures of what it was like to walk the streets of Moscow, I don't exactly know how much it was successful in being incorporated of every part of like ordinary citizens' life, but it wasn't just art either. It was also especially architecture. And you could probably make the argument that a lot of like Soviet architecture in general, including like brutalism and a lot of iconic Soviet architecture of that sort, probably could have come out of constructivism. There is one piece that we'll see later in the slide that will make my point more or less. But yeah, definitely. And then really quick, I think it's great that you have a different interpretation of the art piece that I said that there's only one interpretation of. That's the whole thing with art is if you're trying to nail it down, you're having a tough time. Even for the Soviet Union is part of the point of one of the lessons that I was learning through this whole endeavor.
Yeah, I think this section did a great job sort of bridging the gap between constructivism and socialist realism as two things that, in terms of form, really couldn't be further apart, at least on the surface, but how they can both be coming from the same ideological standpoint. It seems to me like there's also a difference in terms of the social strata that are being kind of appealed to. When I look at constructivism, it seems to me like it's a movement of the intelligentsia. And then when you move to socialist realism, that's really meant for the masses. And even in the Soviet Union, there was still always that tension between the intelligentsia and the professional strata and the rest of the working class, even when there's only workers. And I wonder if that's kind of what emerged with the Khrushchev thought. You saw the sort of intelligentsia and that sort of strata kind of reasserting itself in distinction to the social realism. That's it.
Really quick, yes, a lot of avant-garde artists, some more begrudgingly than others, became socialist realist artists, and then some of them didn't. So I think the intelligentsia as a whole went through the history of the Soviet Union with shifts and changes, just like anybody else.
So I wasn't really sure of my question until I think got to the end of his section, but I'm actually a semi-decent fan of Kandinsky, so I like that you included one of his pieces. I actually coincidentally bought an art book of his last week, and it arrived. And so from my learning of him, it seems as though, I looked this up to make sure I had it right. So he was involved in organizing the Institute of Artistic Culture in Moscow. And while he was doing that between 1918 and 1921, he was criticized for his work being too individualistic and bourgeois. And so I guess my question is, you included him as a great example of avant-garde, which would be true. So I guess my question would be like, could it be that the realism comes about because it's a great tool for propaganda and you don't want propaganda to be subjective? Whereas with expressionism and things of that nature, it could go both ways, right? It could be seen as avant-garde breaking away from the czar, but then also individualistic in that respect. I think that's my question.
Yeah, so why, I mean, like, there's a lot of reasons why socialist realism ended up coming to be. Want to do a whole class on it? We could do a whole class on that whole transition. I don't think I can answer that question outright, but I will say that they definitely identified elements of the bourgeoisie in the avant-garde movement. And I think that's even accurate to the geopolitical aspects of it. Is there was a bourgeoisie revolution first, right? And then there was a proletarian revolution in 1917. How that all mixes in exactly with the avant-garde movement, I didn't figure out exactly. But yeah, that's essentially, they had to get the good from the bad of the avant-garde movement eventually.
Our final section for tonight will be famous Soviet artists and the famous events and the artists behind them.
Yes, thank you. So before I start, I just wanted to say this is by no means an extensive list, and I expect comrades to, once they get a name here, maybe Google some more information. And this is by no means a top 10, 1 to 10 best artists. These are just an amalgamation, an average of all the artists that I was able to find, and I put a list of a few of them who I think were all distinct from each other enough to talk about. So Vladimirovich Mayakovsky, born 1878 to 1930, was a Russian poet, playwright, artist, and actor. And I believe from my research, he actually wrote more plays than he did art. He became renowned as a prominent figure of the Russian Futurist movement. The Futurist movement is the term of movement of Russian poets and artists who adopted principles of Filippo Marinetti's Manifesto of Futurism, which espoused the rejection of the past and a celebration of speed, machinery, violence, youth, industry, destruction of academies, museums, and urbanism. It also advocated for modernization and cultural rejuvenation. He produced large and diverse bodies of work, including the course of his career. He wrote poems, wrote and directed plays, appeared in films, edited the art journal LEF, and produced agit-prop posters in support of the Communist Party during the Russian Civil War from 1917 to 1922. And that, to the right, is an example of one of his propaganda posters. Next slide. Ilya Mashkov, born July 29th, 1881 to 20th of March, 1944, a post-impressionism Fauvism painter. Fauvism is a style of painting and an art movement that emerged in France at the beginning of the 20th century. It was the style whose works emphasize painterly qualities and strong color over the representational or realistic values retained by Impressionism. His creative works reflected the color revolution of the 20th century, the artistic innovations of Paul Cézanne and Henri Matisse were evident in his paintings, which contained the full-blooded energy of folk art. In the 1920s, 1930s, the artist tried to amalgamate his innovative achievements with the refinement of paintings by old masters. Food, Moscow Bread, 1924. Later, the artist followed the principles of socialist realism, and that's it, Soviet bread on to the right there. All right, next slide. Alexander Alexandrovich Deinica, born May 20th, 1899, died June 12th, 1969, a Soviet painter, graphic artist, and sculptor, regarded as one of the most important Russian modern figurative painters of the first half of the 20th century. He has been described as exemplifying the socialist realist style. His paintings and drawings, the earliest, are often monochrome due to the shortage of art supplies, depict genres, scenes, as well as labor and often sports. Deneka later began painting monumental works such as the defense of Petrograd in 1928, which remains his most iconic painting, and the battles of Sevastopol of 1942, the outskirts of Moscow, and to the right is the Lenin's outing with children, 1938. Next slide, please. All right, Dmitry Nalbandian, 15th of September 1906 to July 2nd, 1993, was a Soviet and American painter and animator. There wasn't too much about him that I could find, but he did get a vast amount of awards. So the Stalin Prize First Class in 1946 for the Joseph Stalin portrait, Stalin Prize Second Class 1951 for paintings Great Friendship and the Power of the Soviet Peace to the People, honored art worker of the Russian Soviet Federal Socialist Republic, People's Painter of the Armenian SSR, People's Painter of the USSR, Hero of Socialist Labor 1976, and the Order of Lenin in 1976. And one of his great examples is the Great Friendship between Stalin and Mao, painted in 1950. Gregory Gregorovich Nisky, born January 21st, 1903, and died 18th of June 1987, was a prominent Soviet painter and founder of the Severe style. Severe style, or early classical style, was the dominant idiom of Greek sculpture in the period, circa 490 to 450 BC. It marks the breakdown of the canonical forms of archaic art and the transition to greatly expanded vocabulary and expressions of the classical movement of the late 5th century. It was international style found at many cities in the Hellenic world and in a variety of media, including bronze sculptures in this round, stele, and architectural relief. The style perhaps realized its great fulfillment in the metopause of the Temple of Zeus in Olympia. So he also had some awards, the People Painter of the Russian Soviet Federal Soviet Republic of 1965, the Stalin Prize Third Class of 1951, and the Order of the Red Banner of Labor. And to his right is Pushkin Square, painted around 1966 to 1967. Tetiana Nilivna Yablonskaya, born 24th of February 1917 and died 17th of June 2005, was a Soviet Ukrainian artist who studied at the Kyiv State Institute of Art under the modernist Ukrainian painter Fedor Krychevsky. Her work was interrupted by the Nazis' invasion in 1941. The greater part of the Yablonskaya's picture Korn, Sacking Grain, and the Park of 1949, Festive Evening of 1960, Together with Father, these are all paintings she's done, 1962, Wedding, 1963, Youth and Nameless Heights, both 1969, Life Goes On, 1971, Evening Old Florence, 1973, and many others are an essential part of the heritage of Soviet art. Yablonskaya's art is characterized by a constant search for ever new means of expression. Her last work shows that the philosophical tendencies in her paintings comes to the fore, while her style is undergoing certain transformation, assuming a more laconic and restrained character. And of course, all the awards she was given listed below. So one of her more famous works is Morning, painted in 1954, and shows a realistic version of a young lady stretching. All right, Monument to the Third International, created by Vladimir Tatlin in 1920. This major construction project was intended to be the headquarters of the Comintern, taller than the Eiffel Tower, able to rotate and broadcast radio signals. And there are obviously one example of it in miniature and him standing by the scaffolding of the actual thing. All right, now here's some other examples and some artists that I haven't mentioned. So Letters from the Front, 1947 by Alexander Lakhtinov. Alexander Labas, just a typical day in the subway there. And then Ekaterina Zuranov, Shelshma Story poster, a little more propaganda looking. Next slide, please. Boris Kurstodev, celebration marking the opening of the Second Congress in 1921. right? And a little more of avant-garde style here with Kazimir Malevich, Mower, 1930. Next slide. And other examples 3, Nikolai N. Baskarov, Milkmaid's Novella, 1962. And Victor Chatalin, Karl Marx, 1984.
All right. Thank you, comrade. All right. So with that, we will go to our final discussion round for time. So
I was just going to comment on the linking of constructivism with socialist realism. My understanding of it was that socialist realism was a correction in that where constructivism sought to do away with the old art forms, socialist realism drew on the idea that in the same way that you're not going to throw out the machinery in the factory, or you're not going to throw out certain techniques in weaving or other areas, you're not necessarily going to throw out all the techniques of art also, because they're the heritage of humanity, I think is how Lenin put it, I believe. Anyway, that was my comment.
thank you, comrade.
Yeah, I didn't, and I may have stepped away for a minute and it may have been discussed. I was curious how and if kind of the Soviet government, I guess, helped to support art and artists. Because, I mean, I think we all know under capitalism, art is definitely not appreciated. It is something that, I mean, I think the art these days is very lacking, is what I would say. So yeah, I was just curious, how did the Soviet Union kind of support artists and whatnot? Yeah, I was curious if anyone knew about that.
So one way I know was there was a artist union that was with the official government, but if you would like to expand on that.
Yeah, I wish I knew more of the specifics, but essentially they had a union within the Soviet Union, and they didn't have to compete with any other sort of social movement or, have to sell their goods on the market in order to make ends meet. So, like I said, I wish I knew more of the specifics, but they had a state-sanctioned place within Soviet society to create socialist, realist art and propaganda. I can say that generally.
So sorry if this is a little off topic. I guess, international export of Soviet art. When I see like socialist realism, I think of actually like Rosie the Riveter. Kind of looks very socialist realist, and people maybe might disagree with that. But that is something that, what were their influences of this socialist realism with that, or what were the international exports of it? I guess what's the answer?
Also, I kind of mentioned this earlier, but that's social realism, which was happening in America. Well, I mean, that's a part is like international art movements kind of happen on like an international basis in general. But the way that social realism was working in America, because obviously it wasn't socialist realism because we weren't a socialist country, is it was a realistic depiction of working class people. And it was government funded to a certain extent as well. I highly recommend looking up more social realistic works. I think you could easily say that a book like The Grapes of Wrath is just a social realistic novel. But then there's like the photograph of the mother in the Great Depression with her hand there. Lots of good works, but that's basically, yeah, that's social realist or realism art.
I just wanted to mention that there was actually like direct wages paid to artists in the USSR, and there was also an art fund where wages paid to union artists would include payments to the art fund, and then in the socialist republics, there was an art section where they kept collections that were often for sale of these artists. So I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you. That's insightful.
Yeah, I was just wondering if anyone else could answer. It seems to me that lots of times art in the past often portrayed like bourgeois figures, leaders, portraits, individuals, things like that. If you do see the masses, they're usually crowded around a central figure. Was socialist realism sort of the first time that mass-produced works of art were depicting working people, and was that a new introduction, or was there any other type of art movement in the past that kind of depicted real life? Maybe not in that form, though.
So, no. Any art throughout history in general usually comes to prominence because the artists gain patrons in the ruling class. That's like the rule of thumb. But as far as your question specifically, no. The depiction of working class people did not start in the 20th century. I'm looking up this one of my favorite art pieces. Realism as a art movement, which spans a long period of time, essentially is that phenomenon of not just depicting kings and their palaces and Jesus on the cross, but actually like, hey, what if we painted like some schmuck on the corner of the street?
60 seconds.
People like 500 years ago would be like, what are you talking about? You're crazy. Why would you paint that? But realism in general, look up the Stonebreakers. That's my favorite realist painting. It was by a guy named Gustave Courbet as a great example in like the mid 1800s. So there you go.
Thank you.
Yeah, so really quick, that third monument to that monument to the Third Internationale actually was not constructed. It was turned into a real fancy model, but no, they never built that, which might lend itself to maybe the over-idealistic nature of constructivism in the first place, and why constructivism didn't stick around longer than they thought it would. And also, real quick, the pronunciation of those two French Impressionist artists is Paul Cézanne and Henri Matisse. My mom would kill me if I let that slide. So thank you.
Thank you, comrade. Another thing that was also constructed as for building at the time, but was never actually built, was the Palace of the Soviets, if you ever look that up. That's a very interesting monument that they thought to build, but never actually built. General Secretary Joe, you have the floor. Go ahead.
I noticed in the section where it talked about Georgy Nisky, it said he founded the severe style. Then it talked about Greek sculptures from 500 BC. I wonder if it's just a coincidence that those have the same name for them, being called the severe style, or if there's any sort of actual connection between the two. Does anybody know about that, or is it just coincidence?
Well, I did briefly mention this as well, but socialist realism was a return to classical art style from literally like the Greeks. That's what the classical art style is the people who invented the standards of art as it's understood through the centuries and centuries. Honestly, that's like art history in general, is the Greeks invented it, and then people were like, let's not do this. And then they're like, actually, no, the Greeks did have it right. And then another time period where they say, no, they didn't have it right. And then they say, wait, maybe they did have it right. That's art history in a nutshell, is deciding whether or not the Greeks had it right or not. And back and forth and back and forth. So that's what social realism was, again, was just a return to the classics through the lens of the USSR. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. With that, we will go to our wrap up as we are just about out of time for today. This has been an awesome class. New Outlook Publishers is our sister publishing house, and for an update on that, I will turn the floor over to comrades.
Please visit our partner publishing house, New Outlook Publishers. You can find it at newoutlookpublishers.store. And I didn't get a chance to get it. We didn't have a chance to get it out yet today, but our latest release will be out by tomorrow. The Communists and the LGBT plus Struggle, Volume 2. And you can check that out. It's part 2. We had our first volume come out last year. So check that out. And of course, buying works from New Outlook Publishers helps support the school. Thank you.
All right, and we will go into the outro of the Internationale.